It's Matt Thomas, aka King Unique, back at Sonic Academy to look at another one of Arturia's software recreations of a vintage classic. Today in front of us is Arturia's Prophet V, which is based on two different synthesizers from a classic manufacturer, Sequential Circuits, run by a guy called Dave Smith, who you might know from his DSI instruments knocking around these days, also under the name of Prophet quite often. And what we're going to look at is the Prophet 5 and the Prophet VS. Now before we get our hands on the machine, we're going to look at the story behind it, because that way you'll know kind of where it fits into the development of synthesizers, what kind of a need it was made to meet, and kind of what made it unusual or special at the time, because if you understand that, you'll maybe kind of start having an idea why you want to reach for it at certain points in the creative process. So the story behind the Prophet 5 is basically how a guy made one of the all-time great synthesizers pretty much on his first try. Well, he nearly did, but we'll get to that in a second. Before he got to making synths, Dave Smith started a company called Sequential Circuits, and he made a couple of digital sequencers when that was really quite an impressive thing in the mid-70s. And then he also came up with a neat idea for how to store the sounds you made in the days of mono synths having no memories. He made a nice little box that you could sort of hack a bunch of cables into the back of your Moog, attach them to his box, and it could then actually store the presets that you made. So that was at the time considered to be quite a groovy trick. And while it sort of solved one of the questions that people had at that time, it didn't solve the big one. And what people really wanted was a polyphonic mini Moog, because the mini Moog was like the synth everybody had, or had to have at least. And what they really wanted to do was get exactly that, but just one where you could stick down a bunch of fingers and get a load of chords. Now Moog themselves had a poly Moog, which was just not really a sort of a polyphonic mini Moog at all. It was just a kind of rotten string synthesizer-y horrible thing. You began getting genuine poly synths like Yamaha's CS80, an amazing synth, but it didn't sound very Moogy. That's kind of one of its shortcomings, I guess. So Dave Smith and his company set out to fix this, and they kind of pretty much came up with a winner, a 10-voice VCO polysynth. It had a recognisably sort of Moogy architecture to the sounds, oscillators into filter, envelopes for the filter and the amplitude. It came in a nice wooden case like a Moog, and it had really nicely laid out controls, looked good, felt good, sounded good. And the only problem was it was incredibly hot in that rather pretty wooden box, and so it went out of tune and was horribly unreliable. So it sold about 10 of these when it became apparent that this was not a winner, so a rather staggeringly audacious solution was come up with, which was to rip out half the voices and just say, da-da, it works now, and it did. So thus became the Prophet 5, a 5-voice VCO polysynth. Just enough notes for you to kind of play a bass line and pick out a nice chord in the right hand, and it was just sonically and in terms of sort of functionality and just really well put together and exactly the right time and exactly what people wanted. Ended up selling about 8,000 units, and it's kind of one of the most successful analog polysynths ever made. Things like the Jupiter 8, the only ones that can compete with it really. So that's the Prophet 5. Having made this kind of classic analog synth, Sequential also made one of the great vintage digital synths, Prophet VS. Now the VS is an unusual little beast in that you got digital waveforms rather than analog, and you had a whole bunch of different sort of stuff, and you could even import a few of your own waveforms over MIDI somehow. Oh, by the way, Dave Smith had helped invent MIDI in the interim. He came up with the idea and got all the other manufacturers on board, so kind of an important bloke. So you've got these 4 oscillators, each with like any one of about 96 waveforms. But here's the groovy bit: is you had a joystick at a time when that was never seen on a synth. And you could push the joystick to the top to kind of favour the volume of oscillator 1, to the right for oscillator 2. And so basically you had like a kind of mixer. The joystick could kind of mix between the different oscillators. And that's kind of groovy. You stand there playing a tune and waggling the joystick, but it's kind of busy. So even more usefully, you could record the movement of the joystick, and then whenever you sort of hit a note, the sound would progress through the movement you'd recorded. So it kind of might go from like a sawtooth to a square wave, back to a sawtooth, up to a a strange hollow pulse width thing. So you get this kind of like a stuff going on, which at the time was amazing, and that's even before you've reached the filters and all the LFOs and that kind of stuff. So that's a Prophet VS. Now that never sold in the same quantities as the 5, and eventually cheaper digital synths in the mid-80s meant that Sequential went bust. But Dave Smith went on to work at Korg, and that's where his Prophet VS was kind of reborn as the Wave Station, which was a massive synth in the 90s. Anybody around there will remember that one as one of the big must-have toys. But even that's not the end of the story, because if you fast forward to about the year 2000 and kind of software studios, the Prophet 5 reappears when Native Instruments made the Pro 5, which was one of the first VST synths. So again, it kind of like led the first of a kind of wave of huge change in studio technology. So Dave Smith himself in 2002 comes back as Dave Smith Instruments, and then he starts releasing a whole bunch of synths with a Prophet name, the 8, the 12, and there's now a huge thing called the Rev 2. But they weren't really a straight kind of Prophet 5 with more voices. They were kind of new ideas, new sort of architecture, taking the idea forward. A nice little finish, however, is that when Sequential went bust, Yamaha ended up buying the sort of name and taking on most of the team. And just recently, the sort of head guy at Roland suggested to the head guy at Yamaha, now that Dave Smith was back in business, it might be kind of nice to give him his company name back, because they never used it. They just sort of got it by accident and just sort of sat on it. And unbelievably, in this kind of corporate era of royalties and percentages, the guys at Yamaha said, actually, yeah, that is actually a cool idea. So Dave Smith got his name back as Sequential, and so there is now a Sequential Circuits Prophet 6, which is still not a straight copy of the 5, but it's very much kind of beholden to that idea. You got an extra voice and a few more kind of bits and pieces. So now I guess is a good time then, seeing as there's all this activity around the Prophets again, to look at Arturia's recreation of both the 5 and the VS, the Prophet V. So let's get our hands dirty.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content, and if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.